She stopped the Mafia boss from slapping his crippled mother. What happened next was brutal. She took the blow meant for his crippled mother. The Mafia boss's revenge was ruthless. Hook. She didn't even know whose slap she stopped. All she knew was that an old woman in a wheelchair was about to be humiliated in front of everyone. So she stepped in and took the hit meant for a Mafia boss's mother. But what nobody in that room understood was that the man sitting in silence had already decided the fate of everyone in that room before the slap even landed. And the worst part? He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched her take it. Because in that moment, he was no longer reacting to what happened. He was deciding what would happen next. And when the Mafia boss finally stood up, nobody in that room was prepared for what he was about to do. If you enjoy this kind of story, consider liking and subscribing. Let's get into it. The morning light in the Volpe Manor never seemed to reach the corners where Elena moved. To the world, and especially to the man who ruled it, she was a shadow in a black uniform, as vital and as invisible as the oxygen in the hallways. She moved with a practiced rhythmic silence, buffing mahogany tables and arranging lilies with fingers that never trembled. Her only anchor in the cold expanse of the estate was Donna Sofia. While the rest of the household feared the matriarch's sharp tongue or pitted her paralyzed legs, Elena saw the woman behind the steel. As she knelt to tuck a heavy wool blanket around Sofia's knees, Elena leaned in close. "The lavender oil is fresh today, Donna," Elena whispered, her voice a soft contrast to the sterile quiet of the room. She gently massaged the older woman's stiff hands, a small, private rebellion against the loneliness that permeated the house. Sofia's eyes, clouded but observant, squeezed Elena's fingers in a silent, desperate gratitude. Then came the heavy, rhythmic tread of handmade Italian leather on marble. Lorenzo Volpe entered the room like a cold front. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper silences. He didn't look at Elena. He looked through her, his gaze fixing solely on his mother. To him, Elena was merely a functional part of the furniture, a ghost tasked with the maintenance of his past. "The gallows will be here by 8, Lorenzo said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent a shiver of instinctive dread down Elena's spine. He adjusted his cufflinks, his movements precise and lethal. "The atmosphere must be perfect, Madre. Marco Gallo is looking for a reason to bleed us. Do not give him one." "He is a dog, Lorenzo," Sofia spat, her voice raspy. "You invite a rabid animal to our table and expect him to use a fork?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a brief flicker of emotion in an otherwise frozen sea. "I expect him to respect the house. See that the staff is ready." He turned to leave, his coat billowing like a shroud. He hadn't uttered a single word to Elena, hadn't even acknowledged the girl who spent 14 hours a day ensuring his world remained seamless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air in the manor grew heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. The Gallo family arrived not with the grace of guests, but with the swagger of conquerors. Elena stood at the edge of the dining hall, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching the volatile Marco Gallo laugh too loudly and drink too quickly. She saw the way his eyes darted toward Sofia's wheelchair with predatory disdain. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already inside the room. The dining hall was a cathedral of tension, lit by the flickering tongues of 100 candles that cast dancing shadows against the velvet walls. At the center of the long obsidian table, Marco Gallo sat like a coiled snake. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson from too much Barolo and too little respect. Across from him, Lorenzo remained a statue of terrifying stillness, his fingers laced together, watching the way Marco's men hovered near the exits. The air grew thin as Sofia tilted her head, her gaze fixed on Marco with the unflinching clarity of the dying. "You talk of expansion, Marco," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy haze of cigar smoke like a blade. "But you cannot expand a foundation built on sand. Your father was a man of honor. You are merely a man of appetites, burning through his legacy to mask your own incompetence." The clatter of silverware stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Marco's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a low, guttural snarl. He pushed back his heavy oak chair, the screech of wood against marble sounding like a dying animal. He stood, towering over the table, his shadow swallowing Sophia's frail frame where she sat in her wheelchair. He was a man who had never been told no by someone he couldn't break, and the truth of a crippled woman was a debt he intended to settle in blood. "You should have stayed in the nursery, old woman," Marco hissed, leaning over her until he was inches from her face. His breath reeked of wine and malice. "Being half dead doesn't give you the right to speak to a king this way." Lorenzo didn't move. He didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband, nor did he signal his guards. He simply watched, his eyes twin voids of cold calculation. His lack of intervention seemed to embolden Marco, fueling the fire of the man's wounded ego. "Perhaps the Volpe family has forgotten what fear feels like," Marco sneered, his voice rising to a fever pitch. He pulled himself to his full height, his chest heaving. In one violent, blurred motion, he drew back his heavy, ring-laden hand. The room held its breath. The world seemed to slow to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Sophia didn't blink. She stared up at him with icy defiance, accepting the coming blow as the price of her pride. Elena, standing in the shadows by the sideboard, felt the air shift. She saw the trajectory of the strike, the raw cruelty in Marco's eyes, and the terrifying, expectant silence of the man she served. In that heartbeat, the invisible girl realized that the shadow was about to be eclipsed by a storm. Marco's hand began its descent, aimed directly at the fragile jaw of the only person who had ever shown Elena a shred of warmth. The strike was intended to shatter what remained of Sophia's dignity, a heavy-handed blow fueled by the fragile ego of a small man. But the sound that echoed through the vaulted dining hall wasn't the dull thud of a strike against a frail elder. It was the sharp, whip-like crack of flesh hitting skin. Elena had moved before her mind could register the danger. She didn't lunge like a soldier. She threw herself forward like a shield, her slender frame intercepting the arc of Marco's hand. The force of the slap, weighted by Marco's rings and his unbridled rage, caught her squarely across the cheek. The world tilted. Elena's vision splintered into sparks of white and gray as she was spun off her feet. She hit the marble floor with a sickening hollow sound, her apron fluttering like the broken wing of a bird. Silence rushed back into the room, deeper and more terrifying than before. Marco stood frozen, his hands still suspended in the air, his chest heaving as he stared down at the girl who had dared to disrupt his violence. He looked from his palm to the crumpled figure on the floor, a smirk beginning to pull at the corner of his mouth as he realized there had been no immediate retaliation. "A stray dog," Marco spat, wiping his hand on his silk trousers as if Elena's skin had fouled him. "You should train your pets better, Lorenzo." Every eye in the room turned toward the head of the table. Sophia's hand trembled on the arm of her wheelchair, her breath hitching in a sob of pure shock. But Lorenzo Volpe remained an iceberg in a sea of blood. He didn't stand. He didn't roar. He didn't even reach for the wine glass that sat inches from his steady hand. He simply sat there, shrouded in the dim amber glow of the candlelight. His gaze was fixed entirely on Elena. He watched with a clinical, haunting intensity as she struggled to push herself up, her golden brown hair falling over her face. Slowly, she lifted her head. The mark was already beginning to bloom, a violent, angry violet print against her porcelain skin. A single bead of blood escaped the corner of her mouth, staining the white marble. Lorenzo's eyes tracked that drop of blood. He didn't look at Marco. He didn't look at the guards reaching for their holsters. He stared at the bruise on his invisible maid's face as if it were a map of a city he was about to burn to the ground. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. In the terrifying stillness of his expression, a truth began to emerge. Marco Gallo wasn't a king, and Lorenzo wasn't a host. Marco was already a dead man. He just hadn't felt the cold yet. The metallic tang of blood filled Elena's mouth, but it was the silence from the head of the table that tasted like ash. She remained on the floor, her cheek burning with a rhythmic, pulsing heat, waiting for the roar of gunfire or the command for execution. A man like Lorenzo Volpe did not allow his home to be desecrated. A man like Lorenzo Volpe did not let another man lay a hand on what was his. But the roar never came. Instead, the soft, rhythmic clink of crystal against a coaster echoed through the cavernous room. Lorenzo reached for his glass, his movements fluid and maddeningly casual. He took a slow sip of the vintage red, his eyes never leaving the wine as he swirled it. "Marco," Lorenzo said, his voice as smooth and frictionless as silk, "you've had too much to drink. You're becoming theatrical." Marco Gallo blinked, his chest still heaving with the remnants of his adrenaline. He looked at the girl on the floor, then back at the boss, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. The girl was in the way, Volpe. A clumsy accident. "Indeed," Lorenzo replied, finally looking up. His gaze passed over Elena as if she were a spill on the rug, a minor inconvenience to be mopped up by the night shift. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't even offer her a glance of pity. She is just a maid after all. Replaceable. Go home, Marco. Sleep off the wine. We will finalize the shipping routes at my office tomorrow morning. A collective breath escaped the lungs of every guard in the room. The tension didn't break so much as it curdled. Sophia let out a strangled, horrified sound, her hands clutching the armrests of her wheelchair so hard her knuckles turned white. Marco barked a laugh, a harsh, triumphant sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I knew you were a businessman first, Lorenzo. Smart. Don't let a servant ruin a multi-million-dollar merger." He signaled his men, swaggering toward the exit with the air of a man who had just conquered a kingdom without firing a shot. "See you at 9. The heavy oak doors groaned shut, leaving the room in a suffocating, funereal quiet. Elena finally pushed herself up, her limbs trembling. She looked toward the head of the table, searching for some sign, a flicker of rage, a hidden promise of justice. But Lorenzo was already back to his ledgers, the candlelight reflecting off his cold, unreadable eyes. The man she had just bled for hadn't even looked at her bruise. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She had stepped into the fire to save his mother, and he had treated her sacrifice like a discarded napkin. Without a word, Elena turned and fled toward the servants' quarters, her footsteps ghosting over the marble, leaving Lorenzo alone in the shadows of a house that felt more like a tomb than ever before. The air in Sophia's bedroom was thick with the medicinal scent of eucalyptus and the heavy, stagnant weight of betrayal. Lorenzo stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged tear against the moonlight. He had not removed his coat. He looked like a man already halfway to a funeral. "You let him walk out," Sophia said, her voice trembling not with age, but with a fury that burned through her physical frailty. "You let that animal strike a girl who has more honor in her smallest finger than you have in your entire council." Lorenzo didn't turn. Business requires a cold head, madre. Anger is expensive. Business. Sophia let out a sharp, mocking rasp. "You think you know what happens in this house while you are out playing God with men's lives? You think those nurses you hired cared if I breathed? 2 months ago, the cook was bribed. My tea smelled of bitter almonds. It was the maid who smelled it. She drank it herself to be sure, then spent 3 days heaving in the dark so you wouldn't kill the staff and start a war before you were ready." Lorenzo's shoulders went rigid. The stillness that followed was no longer the calm of a businessman. It was the pressurized silence of a deep-sea trench. "She has been my lungs, Lorenzo," Sophia continued, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "She has intercepted letters, vetted the help, and held my hand through nights when the pain made me want to beg for the end. She didn't do it for a title or a ring. She did it because she looked at this family and saw something worth saving. And tonight, you stood by and watched that pig break her face as if she were a cracked plate." Slowly, Lorenzo turned. The moonlight hit his eyes, and for the first time in a decade, the ice had melted, revealing a scorching prehistoric rage beneath. His pupils were blown wide, fixed on a point far beyond the walls of the manor. The realization that Elena had been his silent guardian, that she had bled for his legacy while he treated her like a shadow, tore through his chest with the force of a hollow-point bullet. "She took the poison?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the crystal decanter on the nightstand rattle. "And the blow meant for me," Sophia replied. "She is the only thing in this house that isn't for sale, and you threw her to the wolves for a shipping route." Lorenzo didn't respond. He didn't need to. The coldness hadn't just cracked, it had detonated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of black leather gloves, pulling them on with slow, deliberate snaps. The focused predator had returned, but the businessman was dead. As he walked toward the door, the floorboards didn't creak. They seemed to groan under the weight of the shadow he was about to cast over the city. Marco Gallo had went home to sleep, but Lorenzo was about to ensure he never woke up again. The dawn did not bring light to Marco Gallo's penthouse. It brought a gray, suffocating silence. He woke with the smug hangover of a man who believed he had bullied a lion and survived. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim room, the world felt strangely hollow. Usually, the muffled sounds of his security detail shifting in the hallway provided a comforting rhythm of power. Today there was nothing. He reached for his phone on the nightstand. The screen was dark. He pressed the buttons, but the device was a brick of glass and plastic. No signal, no life, as if the very satellites had decided he no longer existed. A cold prickle of unease climbed his spine. He swung his feet out of bed and crossed the cold marble to the intercom to bark an order for coffee. He pressed the buzzer. Silence. Vincenzo. Luca. He shouted, his voice cracking. No answer. He threw open the bedroom doors, expecting to find his guards dozing or distracted. The hallway was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of presence. The air conditioning had been cut, leaving the air thick and stagnant. Marco stumbled toward his study, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He sat at his desk and pulled up his laptop, his fingers trembling as he logged into his offshore accounts, the millions that bought him his crown and his cruelty. Access denied. He tried again. Invalid account. Every penny, every asset, every cent of the Gallo legacy had been siphoned into the ether. It was as if his entire financial existence had been erased with a single keystroke. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Lorenzo hadn't been weak at dinner. He hadn't been choosing business over pride. He had been performing a clinical, cold-blooded surgery. By letting Marco walk out of the manor, Lorenzo hadn't granted him mercy. He had granted himself the time to strip Marco of every defense, every ally, and every dime before the final movement began. Marco ran to the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, desperate to see his world still standing. But down in the street, 3 black sedans were idling at the curb, blocking the entrance to his building. They sat like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. He realized then that he had been trash to be cleared before the real work started. The lines were dead because Lorenzo didn't want him calling for help. The accounts were empty because Lorenzo didn't want him buying his way out. The guards were gone because they were smart enough to recognize a dead man walking. Marco fell back into his chair, the silence of the penthouse now sounding like the interior of a coffin. He looked at his hand, the one that had struck Elena, and for the first time it began to shake. Lorenzo Volpe wasn't coming for an apology. He was coming for the debt, and Marco had nothing left to pay with but his life. The bruise on Elena's cheek had deepened into a mottled tapestry of indigo and charcoal, a vivid map of her misplaced courage. In the dim light of the servants' quarters, she moved with a frantic, shaky precision, folding her few threadbare dresses into a canvas satchel. Every footstep in the corridor outside felt like the arrival of her termination. She had broken the first rule of the Volpe house. She had made herself visible. In Lorenzo's world, a maid who drew the attention of a rival was a liability to be discarded. She was reaching for her coat when the door groaned on its hinges. Lorenzo stood in the narrow threshold, his presence instantly shrinking the small room. He looked out of place amidst the chipped paint and the scent of laundry soap, a king standing in the dust. Elena froze, her fingers clutching the handle of her bag, her gaze dropping to his polished shoes. "I'll be gone before the sun is fully up, signore," she whispered, her voice thick with the salt of unshed tears. "I didn't mean to disrupt the dinner. I couldn't let him hurt her." Lorenzo didn't move to help her. He didn't offer a hand to steady her trembling. He simply watched her, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the hem of her skirt. "You are packing," he observed, his voice a low, resonant hum that lacked its usual icy edge. "I assumed my service was no longer required," Elena replied, finally looking up. The defiance in her eyes was tempered by heartbreak. You told Marco I was replaceable. I told Marco what he needed to hear so that he would go home and sleep while I dismantled his world, Lorenzo said. He stepped into the room, the air seemingly tightening around them. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and withdrew a small velvet-lined box. He didn't hand it to her with a flourish. He held it out like a cold command. Elena hesitated, then slowly took the box. Her fingers brushed his, a brief electric contact that made her breath hitch. She flicked the latch. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, wasn't the gold pendant or diamond studs she might have expected. It was a heavy, tarnished signet ring, its crest smashed and stained with something dark and dried. She recognized the Gallo family crest. Marco will not be finishing our deal this morning, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly intimate register. In fact, Marco no longer has a name, a home, or a pulse. He took something from this house that wasn't his to touch. Elena looked from the trophy to the man standing before her. There was no apology in his eyes. Men like Lorenzo Volpe were not built for regret, but there was something else. A dark, possessive recognition. That ring belongs to you now, he said, turning toward the door. Wear it, melt it, or throw it into the sea. But do not pack your bags, Elena. Shadows don't leave. And neither do I. The air in the manor's sub-basement was thick with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of old sins. This was a place where the grandeur of the Volpe legacy ended and the machinery of its survival began. In the center of the room, Marco Gallo was strapped to a chair that looked like a relic of a darker century. He was no longer the peacock who had swaggered through dinner. He was a man hollowed out by terror, his expensive silk shirt torn and stained with the grime of his sudden fall. Lorenzo stood in the shadows, the glowing tip of his cigarette the only light in the room until he gestured for the overhead lamp to be flicked on. The sudden brightness made Marco howl, squinting through eyes that were swollen and bloodshot. You said she was just a maid, Marco, Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying purr that vibrated through the floorboards. You said she was replaceable. Lorenzo stepped into the light, holding a tablet. With a few casual swipes of his thumb, he showed Marco the live feed of the Gallo family's main vineyard in Tuscany. As they watched, a series of controlled explosions reduced the centuries-old winery to a heap of burning timber. That was your grandfather's pride, Lorenzo whispered. Now it is ash. Just like your bank accounts. Just like your reputation. He leaned in closer, his face inches from Marco's. By the time I am done, the name Gallo will be synonymous with a mistake. People will stop using it for fear of catching the scent of your failure. The heavy iron door groaned open, and Elena was led into the room by one of Lorenzo's men. She looked small in the cavernous space, her hand instinctively rising to the bruise on her cheek. When she saw Marco, she flinched, but Lorenzo's hand was suddenly on the small of her back, a possessive, grounding heat. Apologize, Lorenzo commanded. Marco looked up, his lip trembling. I'm sorry. For the girl. I didn't know. Not to me, Lorenzo hissed, his grip tightening on the back of Marco's chair. To her. Use her name. Acknowledge the woman who took the blow you were too much of a coward to give to a man. I am sorry, Elena, Marco sobbed, the words falling like lead into the silence. Lorenzo straightened his tie, the ritual of revenge reaching its crescendo. He didn't reach for a blade or a gun. He simply handed the tablet to Elena. Press the final key, Elena. Delete the last of his holdings. Strip him of the clothes on his back and the roof over his head. As Elena's finger hovered over the screen, she looked at Lorenzo. She saw the monster he was, but she also saw the wall he had built around her. With a steady breath, she pressed the button. The Gallo Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a silent 0 on a digital ledger. Marco was left with nothing but his breath and the crushing weight of a man who had been erased while he was still alive. The echoes of Marco Gallo's ruin lingered in the manor like the low hum of a dying engine. But as the week bled into a new reality, the silence of the Volpe estate changed. It was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the quiet, heavy anticipation of a throne room. The great hall was filled with the city's most dangerous men, capos and lieutenants who had lived their lives by the blade and the bribe. They stood in rigid lines, their breaths visible in the cool evening air, waiting for an explanation. They had watched a legacy vanish overnight and heard rumors of a maid who had brought a king to his knees. The heavy oak doors swung open. Lorenzo Volpe entered first, but for the first time in his reign, he did not take his seat at the head of the table. He stood to the side, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a mask of terrifying reverence. Behind him walked Elena. She was no longer draped in the drab black of a servant. She wore a gown of deep midnight velvet that matched the darkening sky outside. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint, ghostly amber, a mark of honor rather than a stain of shame. She moved with a grace that was no longer practiced to be invisible, but to be seen. As she reached the head of the long obsidian table, the seat Lorenzo had occupied for a decade, she hesitated. Lorenzo stepped forward, his leather-gloved hand pulling the heavy chair out for her. The gesture sent a shockwave through the gathered men. In their world, the boss stood for no one. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo's voice resonated, a low, smooth warning that vibrated through the room. "You have all heard the stories of how the Gallo family fell. You have heard of the girl who took a blow meant for the mother of this house." He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of Elena's ear as he spoke to the room, but his eyes were fixed on the men who dared to look at her. "In our world, loyalty is bought, but sacrifice is made. From this moment on, Elena is not a ghost in these halls. She is the heart of them. To touch her is to touch me. To disrespect her is to invite the void." Elena sat. The weight of the chair felt immense, but the heat of Lorenzo's presence behind her was a fortress. She looked down the length of the table at the men who used to look through her, and she saw them bow their heads in a wave of forced, fearful respect. Lorenzo did not sit. He remained standing directly behind her, a sentinel of shadow. The monster who had ignored the girl in the corner was now the weapon at her shoulder. The invisible maid had vanished, and in her place sat the woman who had tamed a beast by bleeding for his blood. As the wine was poured and the business of the night began, the power had shifted. The king was now a guard, and the shadow was finally in the light.